can begin live stream at any time. Excellent.
So, Sergeant, we're live and streaming now.
Okay, at this point, if we can begin our recording. I have my recording going. It looks like the cloud's going, and I'm going to get kicked. Good morning, and welcome to today's remote New York City Council hearing of the Committee on Economic Development. At this time, would all panelists please turn on their video? To minimize disruption, please silence your electronic devices. If you wish to submit testimony, you may do so via email at the following address: testimony@council.nyc.gov. Once again, testimony@council.nyc.gov. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Chair. We're ready to begin.
Thank you, Sergeant at Arms. Good morning, everyone. As we gavel in our hearing for this morning, let me start off by saying we are close to getting to Thanksgiving, so if I do not see everyone again, have a blessed, safe, healthy holiday to everyone as we enter into another strange time here in New York City, but as always, we will get through it. But good morning and welcome to the Economic Development Committee of the New York City Council. Today is Friday, November 20th, 2020, and my name is Paul Malone. I have the privilege of chairing this committee. I'd like to extend my thanks to my fellow committee members. As of now, right now, I have Councilmember Mark Jonai, Peter Koo, and Keith Powers with us, as well as the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation for coming together for today's hearing. The purpose today is to discuss the impact that COVID-19 pandemic has had on businesses at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, how businesses at the Navy Yard have pivoted to PPE manufacturing, and what has been done by the Navy Yard businesses to bring these essential materials to those of us who need them most. Last June, the committee had the opportunity, and it was a wonderful one, and I thank everyone for joining us as we toured the Navy Yard along with our colleagues at EDC and took the ferry down from City Hall and did one of our things that we've been, as a standard, is going to the sites for committee hearings, which was wonderful, and hopefully we get to do that again maybe this June. And it was a pleasure to see firsthand the various businesses and education centers available at the Yard. From WeWork to Dock 72 to the Steam Center, the Navy Yard is a gem for opportunity and talent in the industrial, technological, and manufacturing industries, as well as a hub for specialty grocers such as Wegmans and Russ & Daughters. At a hearing held by this committee in January 2019, we also had the opportunity to discuss much of the rich 220-year history of the Navy Yard, as it has evolved from the early years as a naval shipbuilding yard into one of the city's most well-run engines for economic development. Nearly all of the Navy Yard space has been leased over the last decade, and so the Navy Yard Development Corporation announced its $2.5 billion master plan in just 2018 to expand the physical space at the Yard in order to meet the ongoing demand for new tenants, to utilize the innovation space, and continue to offer opportunities in manufacturing, technology, and industry right here in New York City. The goals outlined in the 2018 master plan were in brief to create 10,000 new jobs by 2020 and add 5.1 million square feet of manufacturing space to the Yard to employ around 30,000 people by 2030. We on the committee commend the Navy Yard Development Corporation and the laudable goals set forth in its master plan. We hope to hear the progress of those goals during today's hearing, and we'd also like to receive regular updates on the progress of the master plan. This is why I have sponsored the bill before the committee today. Intro 1839 would require the Naval Yard Development Corporation to submit an annual report to the Mayor and City Council on the progress of achieving the goals of its master plan. As stewards of the general welfare of the city, its workforce, and its budget, the bill is designed to provide regular updates to the city's elected officials on what progress is being made in this $2.5 billion undertaking at a Navy Yard, which is under a 99-year lease as tenants to the city of New York. We applaud the Navy Yard businesses for their hard work throughout this pandemic and recognize that perhaps as a result of the ongoing crisis, the goals set forth in the original master plan might be somewhat delayed or changed. Nonetheless, we wish to discuss the progress of the master plan, whether there is anything we as a council can do to aid in its progress and success, as we have seen. And before we turn to testimony from the Navy Yard, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Economic Development Committee staff, who is as my second family. We love them all, and they have made us entire council shine together. My legislative counsel, Alex Polinoff, my policy analyst, Emily Forgione, and finance analyst, Aaliyah Ali, as along with my chief of staff, Jonathan Shuck, my legislative director, Ahmed Nazar, and also my entire staff for working with me. I'll now turn over to our moderator, committee counsel, Alex Polinoff, to go over some procedural items.
Thank you, Chair Vallone. I am Alex Polinoff, counsel to the Economic Development Committee of the New York City Council. Before we begin testimony, I would like to remind everyone that you will be on mute until you are called upon to testify, at which point you will be unmuted by the host. I will be calling on panelists to testify in order. Please listen for your name to be called. The first panelist to give testimony will be the President and CEO of the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, David Ehrenberg. Brooklyn Navy Yard Chief Development Officer, Johanna Greenbaum, will also be available for questioning. I will call on you shortly when it is time to begin your testimony. During the hearing, if council members would like to ask a question of the administration or of a specific panelist, please use the Zoom raise hand function, and I will call on you in order. We will be limiting council member questions to 5 minutes, which includes the time it takes to answer questions. Please note that for ease of this virtual hearing, we will not be allowing a second round of questions for each panelist outside of the chair. All hearing participants should submit written testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov. Before we begin testimony, I will administer the oath. To all members of the Brooklyn Navy Yard who will be offering testimony or will be available for questions, please raise your right hands. I will call on each of you individually for a response. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions? President Ehrenberg.
Yes, I do.
Chief Development Officer Greenbaum.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. President Ehrenberg, you may begin your testimony.
Great, thank you so much. And Chairman Vallone and fellow council members, thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which I'll refer to as BNYDC or the Navy Yard kind of interchangeably throughout this testimony. You may recall that we last appeared before the committee 2 years ago to discuss how BNYDC had become a national model of urban revitalization and economic and workforce development. As was noted, we had you out to the yard last June. We would love to have you all out this June if a vaccine is widely available, which seems more and more likely. You know, when last we spoke with you both those times, we could hardly have envisioned the environment within which we now operate in and we've been operating in for the last 9 months or so. Just a little bit of background, the Navy Yard is a mission-driven not-for-profit that serves as the real estate developer and property manager of the physical Navy Yard on behalf of its owner, the City of New York. Our mission, put simply, is to preserve quality jobs, grow the city's modern manufacturing sector, and perhaps most critically, connect the local community with the economic opportunity and resources of the Yard. During this testimony, I will first discuss our ongoing work in response to the pandemic, and then we'll discuss the progress that we've made on our master plan. Since March, the Navy Yard and many of its tenants have played a significant role in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. While this has been an incredibly challenging time, it has shown us and the city at large the value and impact of the Navy Yard operating model. Our response to the pandemic and ensuing economic downturn can be divided into 3 areas. First, our work to help tenants pivot to manufacturing of personal protective equipment, or PPE. Second, our work with our tenants to help them survive this difficult time. And third, our continued commitment to the surrounding community. As to PPE production, as many of you probably know, the Yard became a central hub of PPE production in the early days of the pandemic, when the city faced shortages of everything from face shields to medical gowns and ventilators. The response and ingenuity of our tenants to this crisis was truly inspiring. Not since the Navy closed the facility in 1966 has the importance of local production been so plain for our city. Very early in the crisis, we began working with City Hall, DOH, HHC, and the EDC to identify critical PPE shortages for which the international supply chains had frozen and that we believed we could manufacture at the Yard. Ultimately, the Yard became the central hub of the local production efforts, producing nearly 10 million units of PPE and more than 26,000 gallons of hand sanitizer. What I most want to communicate today, and this is a little bit hard to explain, but is that it was no coincidence that these activities were centered at the Yard. It was a result of the basic operating model and the public and nonprofit stewardship of the property over decades that created the environment where this was possible. It's not just the fact that we've retained manufacturers at the yard that made this possible, though. It's the connective tissue, the social infrastructure that BNYDC as a nonprofit landlord has created that allowed us to so quickly work with our tenants to establish these production lines. While tenants manufactured PPE across about a dozen products, I'll focus on just 3 today: face shields, medical gowns, and ventilators. Within days of the onset of the pandemic, DOH identified these 3 items as the most critical shortages that local production could help fill. To take the example of face shields, that production was identified as an immediate need on a Thursday call in mid-March between us, DOH, and HHC and EDC. That afternoon, the Navy Yard security team picked up a sample of the product that DOH needed. And actually, we picked it up from the apartment building of a local doctor who had taken it home after one of his shifts. And we delivered it to a consortium of tenants we had identified as uniquely set up to produce these products. By Saturday, so 3 days later, a prototype of the product was delivered to DOH, and by Sunday, the design was approved. Monday and Tuesday were spent sourcing needed materials and establishing the production lines, and by Wednesday, the assembly line was up and running. By Thursday and Friday, the assembly line was producing tens of thousands of face shields every day. That identification of our tenants really, again, was only because we knew who they were. We knew what products they had, what technology, what equipment they had, and we were able to match a couple tenants together in order to get that assembly line up, something that would have been much more difficult had we not been so intimately involved with our tenants. Simultaneously, we were working with the EDC to establish a procurement process because, of course, the city had never done anything like this before. And it's a very important point to stress that our tenants did what entrepreneurs do best. They identified a problem and immediately got to work. In many cases, it wasn't until weeks after they started production and had been spending their own capital that the contracts were actually signed. While more technical in nature was a similar story for medical gowns. This time, our security team actually drove 4 hours upstate to hand deliver samples of gowns that DOH needed to one of our tenants' sample makers who had relocated with his family to upstate. Within a week, 2 of our tenants had partnered to cut the required patterns of small, medium, and large, and develop what's called a tech pack that lays out all of the material requirements and other specifications for the product. A few days later, over half a dozen companies across the yard had assembly lines up and running to produce these gowns. And that pattern and the open source tech package developed at the yard were then shared via EDC with producers across the city who used them as the basis for their own production lines. Finally, as our hospital systems grappled with the terrifying possibility of widespread ventilator shortages, a fear that thankfully never fully materialized, a group of high-tech product design companies based at New Lab, our incubator for such businesses, sprang into action. Working with a manufacturer in Long Island City, they designed and manufactured a ventilator model that could be produced in a matter of weeks, the timeline that the crisis in New York demanded, but that could not possibly be matched by the existing supply chains. And again, this is a matter of the ecosystem that we've developed. We have become a central hub really across the country and in many ways worldwide for high-tech product design companies. And it was these companies based in New Lab, but partnering with other companies outside New Lab that were able in a matter of a couple of weeks to develop the design for an open source ventilator, something that boggles the mind and which you could not have simply turned to any old product company and asked them to do. It really is the ecosystem and community that we've built over time that allowed this to happen. Each individual story of a tenant pivoting to PPE production was heartening and played a real role in keeping our nurses, doctors, EMTs, and other first responders safe. But the fact that so much of this activity occurred in our tenant businesses and they were the first out of the gate was not a surprise. For decades, we had been building a community of next generation manufacturers and providing the means for them to collaborate with each other and the city when the need arose. Creating this community of manufacturing tenants and an environment where they can collaborate certainly is not rocket science. However, it does take real dedication and stewardship over the course of years and decades. The importance of this work is clear to us every day, given the diversification of the city's economy we allow and the thousands of local residents who have access to high quality jobs at the yard. However, we believe that the last 9 months has been a real public statement about the importance of the yard and local production for the city as a whole. Now, moving on to how we've supported our tenants through this crisis. We've had to ensure that our tenant businesses can get through this extremely difficult financial period. As a landlord, we've worked with every single tenant who has identified a financial hardship, which is many of them, to defer and abate significant amounts of their rent. Our rent deferral and abatement program is, to our knowledge, the most generous in the city among commercial landlords. In addition to rent flexibility, as part of our model, we have an in-house business support services team that provides our tenants with various forms of support to help them scale and grow. Throughout the pandemic, that team has led our efforts to help yard companies stabilize themselves and cope with the financial challenges of the downturn. And they've led more than 60 trainings and technical assistance sessions in recent months. Obviously, the Payroll Protection Program, or PPE, looms very large for small businesses in getting through this pandemic. And our tenants saw the same problems with the first round of the federal PPP program that were well documented in the media. We are only aware of 8 tenants who successfully received a PPE loan in the first round. Before the second round was even announced, we developed a comprehensive program to ensure that our tenants would get loans in the second round. We secured a funding commitment from the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs with their lending partner, Pursuit Lending, and developed partnerships with Piedmont and Carver National Bank to assist yard tenants in securing these loans. We also provided additional training and technical assistance as needed to help companies apply successfully. These partnerships translated into every single eligible tenant at the Navy Yard that we were aware of receiving a PPP loan. That's more than 130 in total. So we went from 8 in the first round to 130 in the second round. We know that the pandemic hit communities of color the hardest in the city. Acknowledging that reality, combined with addressing this summer's nationwide movement regarding social and racial justice, reaffirmed our commitment to our minority community, particularly the Yard's Black-owned businesses. For the past 3 months, we've surveyed the needs of MWBEs, and particularly MBE companies, to help address the systemic barriers minority entrepreneurs face. This is an evolving area of work for us, but immediately we've launched an MBE programming that includes a quarterly small business education series that sets MBE tenants up to move past $1 million in revenue and grow their workforces. In addition, we've created leadership and networking opportunities with partners like General Assembly and have helped MBE tenants access grants and other programs through local partners such as LISC. We've also, as I said, kind of redoubled our efforts or refocused our attention on our local community. It goes without saying that our focus on ensuring economic opportunity for our neighborhood has become ever more important. It's something that we are focused on every day of the year, throughout the years. It doesn't, the pandemic has not fundamentally changed that, but it certainly has sharpened that focus. And in August, again, to address the systemic barriers that minorities and particularly Black entrepreneurs face in launching and growing businesses, we announced plans to develop an equity incubator, a cutting-edge space designed to support Black and brown entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses in their efforts to create, develop, and grow their companies. Through an initial $2 million investment of capital from the City Council and operating from support from SBS, we're now in a position to move this project forward. And we thank the Council and administration for their support to date. What's happened in that is that we've recently released an RFEI to find an operator for that incubator. And we will be getting responses back in January. It was intentionally a very open RFEI seeking ideas from social entrepreneurs about what they believed would most help MBE businesses. We have our own ideas, but we really want to hear from other organizations, other nonprofits, and like I said, other social entrepreneurs to get the best ideas out there before we made a selection. We've also recommitted to our work with our employment center, which trains and places local residents into jobs at the Yard. The center connected a record-breaking 589 people to jobs in fiscal year 19, marking a 28% increase from FY18, which had increased significantly from FY17. Of those, 90% of the hires were Brooklyn residents, and more than a third lived in public housing. Approximately a fifth experienced long-term unemployment, and another fifth were previously incarcerated or convicted. Not surprisingly, the focus of our workforce development team has changed dramatically since the economic downturn began. They focused on placing local residents into jobs in those companies that are hiring because of the PPE production. But acknowledging that companies are hiring fewer people than they were a year ago, we've also refocused on our efforts on developing innovative models that can potentially be replicated outside the yard. Most recently, as our internship numbers dropped during the summer, we continued our internship program, but we developed a new, more intensive model for an internship to employment program with CUNY that we're hoping to expand beyond the yard. Moving to our master plan, the Navy Yard has grown dramatically in recent years. Just before COVID set in, we had reached about 12,000 jobs on site, doubling the roughly 6,000 jobs of 7 years ago. And based on projects that we have recently completed, we were projected to reach 20,000 jobs within the next 2 years or so. Our master plan is a bold vision of how to continue this growth past that 20,000 jobs by building new modern manufacturing buildings, the likes of which have never been built in urban America. This master plan, when fully executed, will create an additional 10,000 jobs, bringing us to a total of 30,000. The first step in this master plan is to establish a special zoning district for the yard through a ULURP. The land use changes needed in this ULURP would be comparatively limited, but essential for our continued growth, given that the underlying manufacturing zoning has not been changed since the 1960s. The major land use actions we plan to request are to limit the amount of parking and loading bays required. Modern manufacturers simply don't require the same amount of truck access compared to traditional manufacturers and warehouse uses that were the norm when the existing M zoning was created. We will also seek use changes to allow us to locate more academic facilities on site. Our goal is to create more spaces like the Brooklyn STEAM Center, the CTE High School that we developed and opened last year, as well as community facilities such as Brooklyn College's Fierstein Film School, which is on the Steiner Studios film studio. We believe that these schools and their students benefit enormously by being co-located with related industries, and we would very much like to see more such partnerships. COVID has slowed the progress of this rezoning as we halted our work on the zoning change text at the beginning of the pandemic due to very real budget concerns at the yard. We're now prepared to restart this work, and we're speaking with the administration to determine if there is still time to finalize our work, certify, and complete the ULURP process under this administration. Lastly, as members of the committee may know, we hold quarterly meetings with our elected officials, local elected officials, to provide updates on our work. And we've continued to do so throughout the pandemic. It's an opportunity for us to share plans and continue our partnerships that have given us such deep roots in the surrounding Brooklyn communities. This close relationship with our local elected officials and stakeholders is central to our model, and I personally speak with most of them quite regularly. We understand that Intro 1839 would require the yard to provide an annual report on its activities and progress on the master plan. We see our quarterly meetings as a more frequent and frankly more effective way to keep our stakeholders updated. So while we support the notion of BNYDC keeping our stakeholders fully updated, we don't believe that a bill is actually needed and that it would in fact be counterproductive to our local relationships. As these meetings have proven useful, we would much prefer to continue this model of updating our stakeholders rather than a formal written document. I would also note that we are more than happy to come before this committee as frequently as is reasonable to continue to update you. Thank you once again for the opportunity to discuss the mission and work of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and we're certainly happy to answer any questions that the committee would have.
Thank you, President Ehrenberg. We'll now turn it over to questions from the chair. Panelists from the Navy Yard, please stay unmuted if possible during this question and answer period. And a reminder to Chair Vallone that you will be in control of muting and unmuting yourselves during this period. Chair Vallone, you may begin. Always
a dangerous skill that you're giving us to have the control over muting and unmuting. You sure you want to do that?
It's only...
I have failed every general behavior class in my classes going up to law school for being a little bit too excited in my classes. So David and Joanna, welcome. And as always, we are big fans of all the work you were doing. So, and we also thank you for the tour. You know, this committee really tried to go to places to visualize. I'm old school like that. I like to see the place and understand it, and it helps us to formulate and better know these relationships that you've been building. So we thank you for that. The hearing, I really just want to give you that additional platform with this virtual hearing to let everyone know that work that you've been doing. And on this platform, you can reach so many more people of how critical the role was of the transition period during those scary times where families like ours were struck with COVID in March and didn't have any place to turn. There was these great stories that have emerged through the private partnerships and non-for-profits and EDC and Brooklyn Navy Yard and how they stepped up. So we thank you for that. And honestly, you guys stepped up more than any of the city agencies did. Right? We've learned that the speed at which you and your partners worked were probably the lifeline for the city. So from behalf of all of that, we say thank you. How do you see I guess with how you transitioned in March and now what's happening today, and whether we're, I'm not the scientist, so whether we're in a second wave, whether it's coming, I mean, obviously a lot of states seem to be worse off than we were, but I believe we've done our part to keep the numbers down, and I'm hopefully going to be confident that that takes its course over the winter. But if things were to continue to get worse, how do you see that your position now to handle that second transition that may be necessary?
So I think we learned a lot, and our companies responded extraordinarily quickly. But I think next time, presuming that the input supply chain holds up, they could respond even more quickly in a second wave. At this point, none of our companies are currently producing PPE for the city anymore. Those products that I described went through a procurement process with EDC and were ultimately delivered to DOH's warehouse and then distributed to public and private hospitals. And that work has stopped. Our tenants are still producing a lot of PPE for the general public, and in at least one occasion, one case producing for FEMA as well.
So David, let's just stop there for a minute, because that's important. So you've got to the point where the city is no longer requiring PPE, and now you're doing it more for individual companies or groups or hospitals that are asking for it?
That's right. Our understanding is that the supply chains have freed back up, and DOH has been building up a strategic reserve of the products that we were building, and that they're comfortable with where they stand. I certainly can't speak to that, but we have stopped producing for the city. Our tenants are producing for a very wide range of types of uses. So I've not personally ridden in an Uber for quite a while, but there are now separators between the drivers and passengers. One of our tenants is building those and has installed over 10,000 such separators. So it's quite varied. And again, entrepreneurs doing what entrepreneurs do, which is see a need and address it. But we are working with EDC to kind of put together a playbook, which would include the technical materials that our tenants developed. So that tech pack, which literally goes through, how you stitch the gown together, what products you use, the water repellency of the material, et cetera, so that it's all in one place. If we need it in the next couple of months, obviously we would have it. The idea is if we needed it in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we would have it there as well, then as well. Obviously, the procurement process was also something that was, I would say, a challenge, and it was a challenge for our tenants. But having worked, I've never actually worked for a city agency. I've only ever worked for EDC or the Navy Yard, but I've worked kind of in a city function for going on 20 years now. I was really quite impressed by the speed with which DOH, EDC, HHC responded to this. Was it perfect? Probably not. Were our tenants sometimes itching for their PO to be signed? Absolutely. But given the truly extraordinary challenges of that period and the hours, we at the Navy Yard were working, and all of our fellows, public servants in the agencies were working. The procurement process, I thought, was actually quite laudable. But presumably next time it would, we would just open the page of the book to that, and we'd be able to get a PO very quickly, these tenants.
And that's what our hope is. So that you have already forged that path, and we have had hearings directly just with EDC since they really were the stimulus that created most of this.
Yeah.
And now we hear these relationships like yours and throughout the city. In my eyes, I do have that comfort of knowing that the faucet can be turned on very quickly. But we as council members have districts and lines. I'm staring at City MD on the corner, and once again, there's a daily line on the corner. So we get the calls, and folks are nervous. So when we hear that, we're a little less nervous because we know that the capacity is there to be turned on if DOH or any of our hospital groups need that. So that is a relief. Listen, if the hearing at least brings out that, at least it gives the council members who are here. By the way, let me just re-say which council members have joined us. So before I had said that council members Joe and I, Koo, and Powers. We're also joined by council members Lewis, Lander, Barron, Chaka, and I believe council member Levin, who is the host districts for the Navy Yard, is coming on with some questions. And as always, I get to my council members pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do is just, there's a lot there, but I always like to give, because council members' lives are just as busy as everyone else, and we give them a chance to do their questions. But what the secondary part of the hearing, and David, I wanted to just bring this up now before we go back to the work that you're doing there, what we may have to do to tweak the master plan, if anything, based on the realities of the pandemic and the financial crisis, what we can do to aid and assist, through our budgetary and through EDC and through our hearings. But you ended your testimony with a paragraph that, I wear many hats in life. One of them's a lawyer, one of them's a soccer coach, one is council member, one is a very happy dad and father. But of all the hats that I have, if you were sitting in my chair and you see a bill that's really requiring just data to the landlord of which you are the tenant, when I see that paragraph, I don't really get happy about it. So it says, we understand that 1839 would require the yard to provide an annual report, but we see the meetings as a more frequent and frankly more effective way to keep our stakeholders updated. Well, we are one of the stakeholders, and I'm not sure that the city agencies, I'm not sure who's there at the quarterly meeting, but if you're having the quarterly meeting and you're already preparing the document for that, I don't see the onus or the additional level of oversight that is going to create a less effective way when you're already effectively operating. And this is not bad news. This is good news as to what's happening. And providing either those quarterly and then in a summary annual report over to the committee and the council members that are basically charged with oversight for EDC as landlord of the city doesn't seem to me to meet that level. What am I missing as to why we couldn't already duplicate the information you're doing that could be sent over to the council?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would, and let me reaffirm what I guess was also in that paragraph, which is that we certainly are very committed, and I think it's a absolute central part of our model to free flow of information and being as transparent as possible. I would say I started my career as a community organizer, and so really fully believe in the importance of being plain about what you're doing, and you may not agree every single time, but sharing the information is critical. And I think that the way I would answer that is that the model of the yard is one where we don't have annual reports. We don't approach them as formalistic reports. It is really based on relationships. Would one report to the council be the end of that model? No, of course not. But I think the strength of our model is that when one of our local constituents has a question, they pick up the phone and they just call me, and I just answer the phone and I answer the question. And it's not It's not a relationship that's mitigated through an annual report to the city council and, okay, councilperson, I hear your question, please refer back to the report or something like that. And I've worked and seen other agencies that have more of that formalistic relationship. Would one report radically change it? Perhaps not. But I am all I can say is I'm very committed to or attached to that model of, if you've got a question, just call me and I'm going to give you the answer.
And David, that model has been a wonderful model. Trust me, there are city agencies that don't function anywhere close to the level of the efficiency that you do. And I think, and I've always been a defender of EDC because they are able to operate outside of that bubble that hampers just about every other city agency and works in months of delays and red tape. And to enhance that, and now to our side, talking with you, we as the council members must have information to provide. And EDC also has resisted, and we've gone forward the same thing with just generalization type of data so that we as a council who are the budgetary hand of the city can understand. So just like you, when we get that phone call, we're able to tell our constituents and our committee and our speaker and our mayor what's happening. So I really want you to think about that as not as any way to change the format of how you work such a successful and nonprofit driven business that is that manager for these tenants that enables them to grow in the times that they need. There's a responsibility there. And I think you kind of nailed it on your second paragraph. I mean, that second paragraph, for those who are just joining in, the Brooklyn Navy Yard is the mission-driven, not-for-profit that serves as the real estate developer and property manager of the Brooklyn Navy Yard on behalf of its owner, the city of New York. That's it. That's the hearing in a nutshell for those who are. And because of that relationship, this is a type of bill that would basically be almost mandatory. As far as it hasn't done in the past because of that. If I was the lawyer drafting that, that's exactly what would have happened. So we'll go back to how you've pivoted through the crisis and all the great work that's going on. So to our legislative council, Alex, do you have a list of the council members who have signed up so that they can speak now so we can get them on them?
I do, Chair. And if you just give me a moment, I'm going to just do a quick procedural bit about the Zoom raise hand function for them, and then I'll turn it over to the other members. Thank you, Chair. I'll now call upon members in the order they've used the Zoom raise hand function. And if you would like to ask a question and you have not yet used the Zoom raise hand function, please do so now. Council members, you will have a total of 5 minutes to ask your questions and receive an answer from the panelists. The Sergeant at Arms will keep a timer and will let you know when your time is up. Once we have called on you, please wait until the Sergeant has announced that you may begin before asking your questions. First, we will hear from Councilmember Lander, followed by Councilmember Barron. Councilmember Lander, you may begin when the Sergeant calls time.
Ready for me?
Sergeant.
We are ready. You are still in the same spot. Do we have to send a rescue squad to you, Brad? You were there yesterday.
Thank you, Peter. I was looking this morning for like a good shot of the Navy Yard so I could like make a virtual visit to the Navy Yard, but I don't know. For now, I'm so taken with this new Endale Arch in Prospect Park that I'm visiting on a daily basis. But I'll get back to the Navy Yard soon, both virtually and physically. Thank you, Chair Vallone, for convening this hearing, and thank you to David and Joanna and your team for being here. You know, you guys know I'm just such a big fan of the Navy Yard and the work you do, and so grateful for what you have done during the pandemic. But I really agree, like, not surprised, like the way that you've built a community of people where economic development is grounded in the shared values that we believe in for it. That something pretty special happens, you know, and I think that's really significant. Like, we all know we need entrepreneurs and we need businesses to generate jobs and economic value. But I don't want to get too philosophical, but I feel like there's sort of the invisible hand idea we inherited from Adam Smith that like, that'll just be like greedy people doing their own thing, but it'll add up to common good somehow. And sometimes that works okay, but I think you guys show in some ways a really profound truth, which is if you create the conditions for entrepreneurship and business growth and people to create value, not only will they do things that sort of achieve those goals of priming the economy, but it'll be grounded in the values of like sustenance and the things people need and rising to challenges together. And boy, what you've done in these last few months has really shown that. So thank you for that work. I feel like I ask the same question at this hearing every year, which is really not so much about the Navy Yard as about what lessons it shows and teaches for broader city economic development policy. But it feels even more apropos this year as we are starting to think about the kinds of economic recovery that will take us past this COVID crisis. And even if, David, as you say, the vaccine, Kanahara is coming before too long, we know that we are in for a devastating economic crisis for a long time to come. And there's going to be a lot of challenges in recovery. And, you spoke to what you're doing at the Yard with rent relief and, all those other things. But I want to ask you just to think a little about what the Navy Yard teaches the city as a whole for how to overcome those things. So we're going to see a lot of distressed property, for example, in all likelihood. And, we're trying to think about what we can do to prevent foreclosures and evictions and make sure that businesses can thrive. But I think despite best efforts, there are going to be properties that go into foreclosure, commercial as well as residential, and then plenty of like retail stores. And, we've seen in past crises, especially after 2008, that plenty of private equity and vulture funds will be out there waiting to scoop up those properties and not at all looking to use them in ways that center the goals we have of job creation and real value sharing and equity. And I wonder if you see the opportunity for doing something not the same as the Navy Yard. There's nothing that would be the same as the Navy Yard, but inspired by the Navy Yard. That tries to, take that kind of mission-driven nonprofit, be hard to do over a lot of much smaller spaces, but, imagining what it would be to operate, to take a position in retail stores and create opportunities and for arts organizations, as well as for more of the kinds of productive and light manufacturing. Yeah, I just wonder if you'd offer some thoughts on what you think the lesson shows for what we ought to maybe do as a city. As you know, I've proposed the creation of a land bank, which could not only do residential development, but acquire property to bring it into this model. And I'd just love to get your thoughts on, on what we learned from the Navy Yard for facing the challenge of economic recovery.
Yeah, it's obviously a very hard question. Just going back to your general comments, though, one quick thing. When you said invisible hand, there's a second invisible hand, which goes to the model, which is our invisible hand helping companies create social good as well. And there certainly are a lot of companies, and I would probably say most of our companies that are motivated not just by pure profit themselves, but it's also, that we make it as easy as possible for them when they are looking for interns or hires to find that talent in places where they may not look themselves, not because they're bad people, but just because they're busy and they may not have an HR department. And so when they need an intern,
absolutely,
go to their alma mater for an intern. Again, not because they're a bad person, but it's just the phone number they have.
No, my only point there was, I think, exactly what you were saying, which is when you create conditions that nurture people's ability to be generous and solidaristic, they're a lot more likely to do so.
That's exactly right. And we found that they don't have to be forced to, that you create the conditions and show the value proposition, and they do it anyway. In terms of your other question, so one thing that frankly falls outside the Navy Yard's domain, but I think is going to be really important to think through, is on retail. We obviously do very, very, very little retail. It's really only as an amenity within the Yard, but you're obviously going to see an extraordinary amount of dislocation in retail, in large part because of short-term cash flow issues. And it may not actually indicate a long-term, whether there's a long-term need for that retail. Is just a short-term cash is king and a company fails. I believe a lot of that retail will come back. It's kind of a urban economics 101, that retail is dictated not by incentives or anything like that, but by the purchasing power of the local community. And if the purchasing power is there, the retail will come back. And then you have this core question of who then gets to reopen that business. And when you think about restaurants in particular, They're hard to open and easier to reopen because building out a kitchen is extraordinarily expensive, and moving into somebody else's kitchen that they lost through a eviction is a lot easier. And I have real concerns that all of the dynamics that you see about, communities of color and Black-owned businesses struggling to find friends and family financing will be extraordinarily powerful in the negative in terms of who gets to reopen those businesses. There's going to be some great opportunities in residential areas around New York to reopen restaurants in particular, but retail businesses in general. And it's going to be those individuals who have the liquidity themselves or can turn to friends and family to take those opportunities. And I think that's a real area that the city should be focused on. Again, outside our domain. More specifically, I mean, we're real believers in this idea of identifying and bringing into nonprofit management spaces where the kinds of companies that we nurture could happen outside of the Navy Yard. I will be honest, I think zoning is a blunt tool for those ends. Manufacturing looks like a lot of different things, and to some extent it's you know it when you see it, and taking that decision outside of the market and into a nonprofit's hand, I think is the surest way to make sure that, it's really a manufacturing business and it's not an artisanal pickle maker, which is the example I always use of like, no, we're not having nothing that there's anything wrong with artisanal pickle making.
We love our artisanal pickles, but that's not the economic development model we're trying primarily to promote.
I think there is nothing like a nonprofit. We developed years ago the concept of the Industrial Development Fund, which is now housed at EDC. I think that there will be a real opportunity for that to spring into action. I think and that was modeled off of the affordable housing programs, because I truly believe that like the city doesn't need, I don't quite know how to phrase this, but like we know how to do this. We've got the best affordable housing development apparatus in the country / maybe world. And so when we thought about the Industrial Development Fund, we really just said, what works for affordable housing, and let's just apply it to industrial. Questions of AMI and all of that is a different thing, but the apparatus, the structures that the city has established to make that happen through HDC, HPD, HDC, the second, third mortgages, the acquisition fund, like you've got what you need, and you can just apply that to the industrial space. And I think you would very quickly be able to see some real space. And I think there is interest. I mean, there's concern. Obviously, there's GMDC, there's Evergreen, there are a couple other. We had talked to Cypress Hills Development Corporation, who was interested in entering this space. I don't know whether they're still interested. There are real concerns because, the Navy Yard has fueled our growth with $250 million of debt, private debt.
Right.
That's a real concern for a nonprofit to do that. But I do think that there's an opportunity that, brave entities will be able to take right now.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Lander. We'll now move to Councilmember Barron for questions.
Time starts now.
Great. Thank you so much.
Councilmember.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the panel, Mr. Seitzer, for being here to talk about the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I was able to be a part of that visit to the Navy Yard. It was very inspirational and very informative as to what's actually going on in the Navy Yard. It's very dear to me because I grew up in what was then called the Fort Greene Projects, which is literally a block up on Park Avenue from where the Navy Yard is located. And my dad, in fact, worked as a ship painter in a part of the 1950s when it was a real Navy Yard, a fully functioning Navy Yard. I have a couple of questions. Can you just talk, you just spoke about $250 million debt. Can you expand upon that a little more so that I can understand what that is?
So that's debt that we as the nonprofit have taken. It sits on our balance sheet. It's not an obligation of the city of New York. And we use that to add space to the yard. Over the last 5 or so years, we've added 2.5 million square feet of industrial and manufacturing space to the yard, which is the equivalent of one World Trade Center. So we put our own equity in to that, but a large part of the capital that allows for that those construction projects is debt. So that's where it comes from.
So what impact does that have on smaller entities that might have been thinking about that? How does that impact their consideration about moving there, being able to handle that? And what do you charge per square foot if they want to come in?
Yeah, good question. So this is a very, this is all art, no science on our part, and a real balancing act. We feel that we really do need to expand in order to add more jobs and to bring in more industrial companies who are, otherwise at risk in New York City's real estate environment. So we take debt to add space, and that does create the need for us to pay a very large amount of debt service every year. But we're very aware that we have to keep rents affordable. Because if we expand so much and we take so much debt that then we have to charge more rent, why are we doing it? It doesn't make sense. So we have not adjusted our rent structure. We have not adjusted our rent structure except for kind of annual, every couple of years we take a look at it with our board. And the way we set rents at the yard is really what can manufacturers afford? We do not ask what market is. We share the same zoning as much of Dumbo, and we do not charge the same as what Dumbo charges. We charge what we believe manufacturers can afford. And by that, I mean, not just barely afford, right? I think this is really important also in the context of the pandemic. We're giving rent abatements and forgiveness, not to like just the dollar, to get the last dollar that our tenants can afford. We're making it so that they can afford to continue to invest in themselves, their people, their equipment, and all that, so they're ready to grow. So when we set rents, we're setting them at levels where a company can move into a new space, pay us rent, but then also buy that next piece of equipment that allows them to win a new contract and continue to expand themselves in their workforce. So, rents vary to some extent based on the kind of building that you're in at the yard, but they range from the high teens to the low 20s, with the only exception of in some of our developments, we have small amounts of space that we earmark for office. Those office tenants, we charge very close to full market rents, and that helps subsidize the manufacturers and the other small businesses that move into the building kind of downstairs.
So in the instance where the high school is there, the STEAM high school, is that space that's being rented by the Department of Education for that program, which is a great program, very
yeah, thank you. And I would say in terms of lessons for economic development, I'm a real believer in that. That is now a labor of love of mine. And I think that model of co-locating education, both CUNY, we're working very hard to get more CUNY campuses at the Navy Yard, and high schools co-located with these kinds of businesses is really important. There's a kind of common phrase: you can't be what you've never seen. And getting young students in an environment where they're seeing, folks in the media industry or robotics or engineering and can imagine themselves in that, and also frankly just being taken seriously as students, is, I think, extraordinarily powerful. And I've yet to do a tour of anybody at the time who don't come across as like, fully on board with the model. But to answer your question, so the DOE does pay some rent, again, way below market, because we really wanted to see that project happen. But they do pay us a relatively modest rent. I would say that we have subsidized the STEAM Center pretty dramatically in order to get the model up and running. It's a brand new model. It required a lot of work, a lot of thinking about how the curriculums were going to be developed, the physical space, et cetera, et cetera. So the Navy Yard itself, off our own balance sheet, last I did the calculation, has contributed well over $2 million to the development of the concept. And
then finally, Mr. Chair, if I may, one final question. You mentioned CUNY, and we know that the film school is located in the Navy Yard. And I think I heard you mention some other kinds of partnerships that you have with CUNY. If you could just give us some information about that.
Sure. So there are quite a few. I'll probably forget some of them, but we partner with Medgar Evers. Medgar was the Startup New York designee for that state program. We structured an arrangement with them basically where I'm going to overstate it a little bit, but the entire Navy Yard is potentially part of their campus. So we've struck a deal where any Startup New York company that approaches Medgar Evers can find space in the Navy Yard and is automatically kind of tied into that program, and all of the hoops that you have to jump through to get through that program are taken care of for them already in large part. We partner with LaGuardia Community College, who's now starting to do some trainings at the Navy Yard for our incumbent workers. Actually have a conversation with them next week, I believe, about furthering that. Our largest partnerships really are with City Tech, which is of course 3 or 4 blocks away. We are constantly having conversations with them on various fronts about partnerships. Frankly, my ultimate goal is that they open a part of their campus at the Navy Yard. We're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination, but we've been having those conversations. But the main focus of that partnership is around the internship program, which is, I think, extraordinarily impactful. We take about 150 interns every year, place them, we pay for the summer stipends, we place them into the companies at the Yard. This is to what I was talking about with Brad. You know, our companies, they're often founded by MIT, Harvard, Columbia, et cetera, graduates. And we make it as easy as possible for them to find talent locally. And when it comes to interns, we pay for the summer stipends of a CUNY student. And what we found is that primes the pump and develops a relationship between the company and CUNY that we then no longer need to subsidize. We at this point have, I think it's 3 students from City Tech who came through the Yard, worked with one of our robotics companies, and now work for NASA. I mean, it's anecdotal, but we see those kinds of stories constantly. And those companies who, you know, one of those companies is Honeybee Robotics, which has had robotics on every Mars rover since 2003. And, you know, frankly, City Tech students are not their normal hire, to be honest about it. But they've now developed a direct relationship with the engineering department at City Tech because they've realized what I think we know is that the City Tech students are well positioned for these jobs. They're hungry. They are extraordinarily diligent and hard workers. They walk to work, so they're not going back to Boston or San Francisco at the end of the year. And the value proposition becomes clear. We just need to give that impetus.
If I could squeeze in one more quick question. What is the percentage of Black and Latinos that you have in your corporation itself that's overseeing the Navy Yard and that are tenants there?
So our staff is majority minority. I don't have the exact percentage, but I think we've built over the years a exceptionally diverse staff. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's certainly well more than 50%. And that is up and down the organization. Our management committee is I think quite diverse, not quite as diverse as the staff overall, and that's something that we are working on. I would say one area that we are have been working very hard on and have made progress on is in our direct real estate functions. It may not come as a surprise to the Economic Development Committee that New York City commercial real estate is not the most diverse industry in anywhere. And so we are developing programs to nurture that talent as opposed to just go out and kind of do a standard recruitment, which then you know is challenging to find diverse candidates. But we are developing explicit programs. In terms of our tenant base, hold on, I have that somewhere. Um,
Um,
Donna, do you have the number?
I do. So we have, our companies are broken down between master tenants, so basically people that have a direct relationship with us, and then we have many minority-owned businesses, and that's the rubric that that's the metric that we look at. Not just a diverse person within the workforce, but a business that is owned, that is minority-owned. So our numbers, as far our latest count, and these numbers do change, is that just in the master tenancies we have 130 MWBE tenants of the 309, and if you include subs, that number goes to 145. That it may,
the subs are inaccurate because we don't have perfect information about all the subtenants within the yard, unfortunately, because their contract isn't directly with us. So I think the most accurate one is the direct, which is 130 out of 309. This is, though, council member, an area of concern for us, to be honest. We have looked at the demographics. A lot of those are women-owned businesses. We have a lot of minority-owned businesses and Black-owned businesses, but it is not as diverse as we would like to see. And that is why about a year and a half ago, we started working on the Equity Incubator, which is a small business incubator focused on minority-owned businesses and with a particular focus on Black-owned businesses. We were getting ready to release the RFP when COVID hit, and so we pushed pause because we didn't know, it was impossible time for ask people to come up with new ideas and raise new money. We've just released that RFP this month. We'll be getting responses back in January. And the concept is to have a physical space and a set of programs that are tailored to supporting small businesses with equity at their heart. There are models where that means that they're solely focused on MBEs. There are some that are solely focused on Black-owned businesses. At this point, we are agnostic on that, and we've just asked the nonprofits and social entrepreneurs out there, you tell us your ideas. We want to hear all the ideas, and then we will go through a process.
Maybe David, when you get the results back of that.
Thank you so much. And I know I've over exceeded my time, and I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. And I'm leaving because I'm at another hearing as well.
Well, we love you, Inez. Don't worry.
Thank you. Have a blessed day. Stay safe.
So what we can do, David, is maybe when the RFP starts coming back in January, that'd be great information for Councilmember Barron.
Yeah, absolutely. It probably will not be January. It'll take us some time to go through the process and to understand what we have, but yeah, sometime early in the year.
Some of the, Alex, do we have any other council members have questions?
At the moment, we do not, although we anticipate there might be another one in a minute. So why don't we have a second round of questions from the chair?
Yeah, but David, I always like to go, I guess that's my past tutelage is going through the testimony. You had great stuff there in the Navy Yard tenant support section. And I think that actually can be emulated and followed in many other places. So you put our rent deferral and abatement program is, to our knowledge, the most generous in the city among commercial landlords. And I would tend to think you're right. So I'll give you a minute to explain how you're doing that, because one of the challenges we're doing as council members is how do we get through this financial crisis that the pandemic has created, along with other things. And the landlords just do not have, the tenants aren't paying, and the landlords don't have it. And then you have rent, and then you have city bills that are coming due that aren't being reduced on a city level. And that's what I'm calling for, that reduction. I think this is the type of model that we could put. You put our team efforts help yard companies stabilize themselves and cope with these financial challenges with training and technical assistance sessions. So if you can just kind of guide us through how that's worked, and as a result of those efforts, have you been able to sustain most, if not all, of your tenants?
Yeah. So in terms of rent forgiveness, I mean, this is very hard for, I think, legislatively, to be honest. I'm not a legislator, but we have a committee of probably nearly 10 people who meet every week. including all of our executive vice presidents. So our chief financial officer, Johanna, our chief development officer, our chief operating officer, and our general counsel, to discuss on a tenant by tenant basis. We have a board approved regime, which abates rent and then requires the tenants begin repaying some of that abatement, some of that deferral. But then if they pay back some of the deferral, we then abate the remainder. So it's a way of kind of saying, look, if we'll work with you, but we got to make payroll, we got to pay our debt service, or else the banks take possession of the Navy Yard, which obviously will never happen, but obviously we can't ever even flirt with that. And so we need tenants to pay rent, and we've got to have that. So it's a way of aligning incentives where you work with us, we'll work with you.
So where are you with the occupancy levels now? So if you're where you were from March until now, are you able to sustain?
Yeah.
Or
so I think we've I think we've done exceptionally well here. We have had 7 tenants close since March. All of those, when we talked to them, said, look, I'm at retirement age, and rent deferral or abatement beside, this is the crisis I'm just not going to dig out of, right? Because it is heartbreaking and exhausting for tenants to rebuild their businesses after a downturn, even if they have a landlord who's charging them no rent, which we couldn't do. And so they decided that this was the time to retire, and they did not have a logical person to hand the company off to. So at this moment, we've lost only 7 tenants out of over 400. I think we will see a few more close, unfortunately. We've taken the position that pretty much anything we can do to get our tenants through this, we will do. But if a tenant did not have a particularly sustainable business before this and just can't pay rent now and has no ability in the future to pay rent, then at some point you've got to move on.
So have you seen a change maybe with that change of economic realities that we're in? Have any new tenants then taken advantage of the new leads that Dawn has created? Basically, I mean, there's unfortunately creates with a crisis creates new opportunities for those who can capitalize. So
absolutely, yeah. We've signed a number of new leases. We continue to negotiate and sign leases. That's partially because there's opportunity in crisis. It's partially because when we have space, tenants want to move into the Navy Yard because we're a safe harbor. But we also certainly have tenants that are growing, and that's one thing I would just say about the legislation. Just my humble opinion, my 2 cents here. I think the challenge legislatively is that we have small business tenants who can and should pay full rent. Period, full stop. And that takes a couple different flavors. We've got one who we have been in a very extended negotiation, I guess I would call it, with, where the owners of the company are worth 9 figures, each of them, and they've been withholding rent. And what they're doing is withholding rent from a nonprofit. And they don't need to, and they can afford to pay rent. And that's the position we've taken, which is, yeah, you're a small business. We don't care, pay your rent. I think legislatively, how you, because again, like that just goes to how many interns can we afford to support from CUNY next year? And I'll be damned if I'm going to pick the, company that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the CUNY students. That's never going to happen. So how you balance that legislatively is very difficult. Something that we've said to other legislators who have asked our opinion is that one way to do that is at least to carve out nonprofits. And there are a lot of nonprofits, the Fifth Avenue Committee, Bed-Stuy Restoration, WEDCO, Greater Jamaica, who rely on their real estate to fund their mission. And if you trust them to work with their tenants, which we all are, then I think they can be exempted from the legislation like that. In a position where you're picking a for-profit company over a nonprofit's mission.
But you also don't have to do something. What I've always done is, whatever the bill may be, separate from today, it doesn't have to be for everyone. This can be a temporary pandemic crisis financial bill, where for a year upon year you sunset and look at it, maybe you do give, I love what you just said, that nonprofit flexibility to be able to foster and handle those relationships themselves, and maybe do take a little bit less for the overall gain that we're keeping those jobs and keeping the city, the place to go. So yeah, no legislation should ever hinder that, especially something like this. This is just what the year or annual quarter, however you really want to set it up, transfer of that information, because in all honesty, it's just now as most of the council members are coming down to the last part of the segment, is how can we leave this committee better for the next four? And what were some of the challenges that we had to face when we took in? And honestly, when the wonderful ride I've been on this committee is just for the visiting places and learning these gems throughout the city. None of that was ever really kind of known. And it was just kind of assumed that you just kind of went through and let EDC and did that testimony. And then we meet folks like you who are doing such wonderful things. And you want to be able to just say, look how they made this work. And maybe use that formula to help out others. I don't want you to look at anything, especially in a bill that's really just a data information, to hinder your ability to run on that. I would never do that. In fact, like when we deal with New York and Company, and we've gone back and forth on similar issues, and we've pulled back on some of the legislation or changed it, or to make sure that they weren't hindered in any way, because we don't want to do that to Fred Dixon either, or any of the groups. But there's something on our end that we need to be able to have something substantial so that we can see, okay, look at the work, look how they pivoted during the pandemic. So that would never take the level of getting into negotiations between you and the master plan, though. So I guess since we're talking about how you're altering your vision through going through all this, do you see any changes because of what we're going through in these last 6 months, or do you think you're comfortable that we can still go forward?
Well, we certainly believe that we need to continue to go forward with the master plan for sure. Again, the last 9 months to us has really been an extreme lesson in the importance of the Navy Yards model and the importance of local production and local high-tech production in particular. So we're, if it's possible, we're more committed to executing the master plan. On timing, like I said, we stopped our lawyers and urban planners' work at the beginning of the pandemic because of our own cash flow concerns. So there is a timing question about the ULURP. In terms of the actual development of the buildings, I think that is to be determined. We have delivered over the last year, we delivered about 500,000 square feet of new manufacturing space to the yard. We had certain assumptions about how quickly that would lease up. And while we are still signing new leases, and there are actually a couple of very exciting leases that we may be signing soon, that has slowed down a bit. It's yet to be determined how much of that slowdown, how long that slowdown will last. Obviously, we will not want to build another building while we're still trying to lease up this 500,000 square feet of space.
So maybe, right where you are, keep that thought, because I know Councilmember Levin is just come on, and I'm looking at him, and I know he's master tasking between family planning and the rest. So I want to give you a chance there to speak while we have. So Councilmember Levin, if you wanted to jump in on your questions, and then I'll continue on.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ehrenberg. I appreciate the opportunity to just say a few words. My car battery died, so I had to get a jump and pick my kid up from art class. So anyway, I just want to just express my appreciation to the Navy Yard, to David and his staff. They've been an exceptional partner to New York City government for the last 20 years. First under Andrew Kimball's stewardship and in recent years under David's stewardship, where it's showing how to do economic development right. There are a lot of kind of advantages that the Navy Yard has that don't necessarily translate to other parts of the city, but there are aspects of the Navy Yard that could be adapted either to other areas, IBZs, industrial areas, throughout the city, and it has the great benefit of being mission driven and not for profit, and can invest back into the businesses that are in the yard. And so and I think I speak for elected representatives up and down our system, so state and federal representatives. We all stay very close contact with David and his staff. So I just want to again express my appreciation and knowing that these are really uncertain times for small businesses, really difficult times for small businesses. And so the idea that the Navy Yard has been there as a when we talk about what small businesses are surviving and which ones are not at this time during COVID, who the landlord is a very important part of that equation. And the fact that the Navy Yard is there for so many of their tenants is one important aspect of ensuring that they survive and eventually are able to get back really on their feet. So again, just want to thank David for the work that he and his staff have done, and I want to thank the chair for having this hearing.
Councilmember Levin, we are all very jealous that you get to have this wonderful in your district relationship then, and it is really a model. I could only imagine if we could bring something like that to College Point and not here to Flushing. So,
and while it's technically in my district, we've always shared the Navy Yard, the 33rd and the 35th district as well. So our Attorney General, Letitia James, was very dedicated to the Yard during her tenure, as is our current colleague and Majority Leader Lori Gumbo.
Well, you be safe. If you need any help with the jumping of the car,
we're all good. AAA came out.
We will send the crew.
Some rust issues, but I think we're all right.
Perfect. Thank you. Do you have anything else?
Thank you, Chair.
So, David, you were doing some changes to the master plan. You just talking about the possibility.
Yeah. So
I want to wrap that part up.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the obvious statement that the economics to some extent have changed. So we'll have to see in the next year or so how much of that space we lease up, because we will not want to start construction or development on a new building until we're very, very far through leasing that existing 500,000 square feet. There is to some extent an unknown there, because when and if we find an anchor tenant for the manufacturing space in those buildings, we will want to move as quickly as possible. And that is independent to some extent of the current downturn. We have large tenants at the Yard who are taking more space because their business is not directly affected by the pandemic. So if one of them needed 100,000 square feet and we could build it for them, we'd want to do it, which is why we're eager to complete the ULURP, so we have that in hand and can then move to construction quickly if a large manufacturer shows up.
Where are you on the ULURP process?
We are, like I said, we paused it at the beginning of at the beginning of COVID because of just the lawyer bills. So we are prepared to restart that, and we're talking to the administration just about the timing. And DCP's got a lot going on, so we're trying to figure out the bandwidth and when we can slot back in.
Well, and again, that's where I would say how we could be of assistance. I think you have a council member crew here that is fully on board. So if you have our time together, it might be something that we can help, because we have full knowledge of the work that you're doing. So if we can help in any way to support that, because nowadays any type of zoning application creates a mini firestorm everywhere. So and it turns into something, because outside sources come in and create an issue that's not what's local. So having your local story to defend against that, we'd be happy to help you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we appreciate that. We've communicated that to the administration. I think they know it anyway, but excuse me, I'll reaffirm that.
Is there any, I know with you had the master plan and then you had the $1 billion expansion. I guess that's kind of all intertwined.
Yeah.
Or is there any part of the expansion that's also been kind of put on hold, or are we all?
No, the expansion really is our current work, which will take us up to 20,000 jobs. And that all those construction projects are done and they just need to lease up for us to hit that 20,000 jobs. So that's not changing at all. The next phase, everything about the next phase requires the ULURP. Because if we don't have the ULURP, we have to build an absurd amount of parking and an absurd amount of truck loading bays, which is unwise for us, and we think unwise for the local community because it's just drawing more traffic rather than less. So this ULURP will be interesting because it's actually about reducing traffic. It's about reducing truck utilization rather than increasing. We're not asking for more density. We're not asking for more bulk. All we're asking is to reduce the number of cars and trucks.
See, that sounds like such a horrible thing to ask. What is wrong with you? You want to reduce the commercial traffic footprint in the neighborhood? This is horrible. We have had battling that in College Point as different, one of the few areas within industrial zone and nonprofits and city agencies all kind of intermix amongst residential housing. And that's always the balance, is reducing the amount of commercial traffic in that these just naturally generate, and the waterfront that you have. So is one of the areas of expansion of the use of the waterfront to offset some of that commercial traffic, or is that just a separate?
So that's a very good question. We have an active ship repair facility at the yard, which takes up the vast majority of our waterfront. And they are expanding. We are going through a multi-decade, frankly, process of improving the bulkheads and piers and the like. And as we do that, they move back in and can win more contracts and do more work. At this point, the master plan buildings need to be flexible enough that they would allow for that use and that connection to the waterfront. There's the state RFP for offshore wind. We are one of the locations that are identified in the RFP as a potential site for some of that activity. That would largely be around the ships that have to go back and forth and repairing and potentially building some of those ships, et cetera, et cetera. If we found an anchor tenant who wanted to do something like that in one of our master plan buildings and needed a connection to the waterfront, we need the flexibility in the ULURP to allow that to happen.
So let's make sure you include that, because that is, we have a waterfront district ourselves, and there has been so much inability to access that over just, not so much even misuse, it's just kind of decades, like you said, of just people kind of forget about these wonderful areas that can turn into community joint partnerships with the use of parking, walkways, and having actual ships take away from the trucks coming into the street. And there's that balance that we can really tap into. So that'd be another one we'd be happy to help with.
Yeah. And that balance is, again, to some extent, like, we're not going to be able to specify it precisely in the ULURP because we don't know whether it's a shipbuilder that's going to want space, or somebody building the blades of the turbines, or something entirely different. And so part of the ULURP will be making sure that that flexibility is preserved.
When you took us through on that great tour, you were showing us some of the buildings. I hope we do get to come back one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Just the whole fair experience over City Hall with you, and showing folks how easy that is. Was an eye-opening. A couple of the buildings, they said was like 127 and 303 that you were kind of working on, or they're fully open. How are those two? Are they all done?
Yep. So 127 is both are now complete. 127 7, we actually got the TCO in the middle of COVID during the pause. Our team did an extraordinary job making sure that that happened because we were using tax credits that if we weren't able to complete the project during the pause, we would have paid huge penalties to bank. So that got its TCO. We are in late stage negotiations with 2 tenants to take half of the space. We haven't signed leases yet, but we have the term sheets and the leases are out, and they've gone back and forth a couple of times, and we're expecting to sign in the next couple of weeks, maybe month or two. So delivering a building, that's a relatively large building, it's 100,000 square feet, delivering a building during COVID and having it 50% leased almost immediately, I think is again a testament to how much this kind of space is needed. And then in 303, that's also been completed, and those are smaller units, and we are signing leases. That again has certainly slowed down. Small businesses are to a large extent waiting and seeing, but we are getting leases signed with real manufacturers in that building, and our expectation is that again when we get through this winter and perhaps early spring, and there's a vaccine out in the market, that those companies that have survived will all of a sudden see the logic of moving into the yard and moving in general and cementing their space. And so we're expecting that in the coming months we'll see a lot more activity there.
Well, I think that how we started the hearing with telling us how you survived through the pandemic and how you pivoted to providing the PPE equipment and what we needed here, and knowing that you have that ability to turn that back on as the uncertainties of the winter months come upon us, was very relief to all of us to know that that backup is in place, and that's what we didn't have in March. So that to me, knowing or not knowing what's coming, knowing that you're there and with EDC and the partnerships that are in place to turn that engine back on is so critical. So Alex, our counsel, I saw Councilmember Machak is on. Carlos, did you want to have any questions before we wrap up? Perfect, go for it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee, staff, and David. Good to see you. It's been a while since we've sat in rooms, but we were in rooms intensely during and up into the ramp up of the Industry City conversation. And so I want to thank you and your team for really opening up the doors to the Navy Yard. The Navy Yard is not a stranger to me. I was the capital budget and economic director for Marty Markowitz. And so the Navy Yard is a place where I've kind of seen grow and believe in it. I'm going to offer a couple comments and then end with a question. I think the Navy Yard has become this really interesting thing when you look at mayoral intentions, and it's felt like almost like a pet project. Like, oh, this is a really interesting thing, let's support it. But what I just heard you in today's testimony and back and forth with council members, that it's more than in just this like siloed experience. This could really be a massive modeling for the engine to start again for economic repair of our city. And I'm now kind of thinking about Sunset Park and the battles that we were having from the very beginning in Sunset Park about really thinking about the assets in Sunset Park, the city-owned assets, and really creating almost like a Navy Yard in Sunset Park. Those words were fighting words for EDC, because they sure as hell don't want to let go of that property because it is incredibly lucrative. It brings in a lot of profit to this organization, the EDC. And so my question to you, as we discuss these questions of like understanding the model, getting more reporting from you, getting a sense of like how it actually works, my question to you is, how do we think about private sector ideas like Industry City that really fail to make the case for these kind of campuses and and really looking at the Navy Yard as a way to kind of understand how we approach other city-owned properties on the waterfront that have access to the water, that can be engines of economic opportunity, and really expand the Navy Yard across the city. And so what elements are needed? And I'll probe you a little bit with the concept of just incredible subsidy. This can't work without subsidy. You can't do what you do. And so that's okay. And I think that there's been some previous mayoral attitudes that's not okay. But look at all the beautiful things that you've offered this city of New York with incredible subsidy, public funds for the public good. And that's been something I think that many administrations, including the EDC, I think are still struggling with. And look at how we've been celebrating you for over 2 hours now. This is no longer a pet project. I think this needs to become a centerpiece for future administrations. So maybe you can kind of comment on that as a.
Yeah, so
No pressure, David. It's the backbone for all future administrations.
Right. Well, I'm trying to keep my comments kind of focused on the Navy Yard because, you know, I was at EDC, but I haven't been there for 8 years, and I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on their assets. But I think, you know, the Navy Yard is a special case. We have this extraordinary asset. I mean, I will tell you, when I was appointed by Bloomberg and reappointed by de Blasio, and when I got reappointed by de Blasio, I said, you know, Mr. Mayor, we have 300 acres on the Brooklyn waterfront. If we're not doing something really amazing in the next couple of years, you should definitely fire me, because that would be inexcusable. So we have this extraordinary asset, and you really can't lose track of that gives us an extraordinary amount of flexibility to execute the mission. We tried to do that in no small part by being an experiment ground, by creating models that we do think, at least in part, and a piece here, a piece there, can be replicated elsewhere. I really truly believe that the STEAM Center is something that in public sites or private sites can and should be replicated. That I'm comfortable saying.
I believe you, and I saw that, and I'm a believer, and I wanted it in Sunset Park. It just didn't excite the administration.
So, well, I think the administration is a real believer in the STEAM Center. I can't speak to the dynamics in Sunset Park, but that model, again, I mean, we have not taken a layperson, a local elected official, or a education expert through that space without them saying, this is the model. And we are now actively working on developing a program, toolkit, whatever you call it, to help other locations, either in the city or in the rest of the country, to replicate the STEAM Center. And, you know, the logic of it is extraordinarily simple. I think there are two pieces of it: that career and technical education should not and cannot continue to be thought of the way it's been thought of, as a dumping ground for those who won't pass the Regents exams. Yeah. It's not true. It's never been true. The STEAM Center students pass all of the Regents classes, and they're doing more. And that career and technical education is important. That, you know, you've got high school students who are soon going to be in the workforce, and they need those skills, and that they want those skills, and that, you know, like, I'll take myself as an example. I distinctly remember sitting in high school, and I went to Stuyvesant, sitting in high school in the back of my history class and zoning out because we were talking about King something or another in England. And the teacher calling on me and being like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not paying attention. And I wasn't paying attention because I didn't care. And I shouldn't have cared. I wasn't going to be a history professor, and it was a waste of my time, and I knew it. And high school students are smart enough to know when the adults in their lives are wasting their time. When you tell a student to sit behind a desk and read this book because I'm telling you to read this book, even though it has nothing to do with your life, they know it. And it affects their performance in that class, and it affects their agency in the rest of their life, because you're stripping them of agency. And that's all a young adult wants, is agency. as opposed to you say, oh, you're interested in cybersecurity? Okay, here's a textbook. Read the textbook. What's wrong with reading a textbook on cybersecurity, or not a textbook, right? Like an article about cybersecurity. Why is that worse than reading Jane Eyre? Your literacy class.
I'm with you.
Possibly wrong. So anyway, like I said, this is a labor of love and I really care about it. So, and the other logic of it is that if you're going to do that, you have to do it co-located with business. That you cannot do it in the basement of a high school in a residential area, somewhere in one of the boroughs. It is not going to work. The students are going to know it's not real. You're not going to get the feedback loops that you need with private industry, and you're not going to get the buy-in. What we found is that we put the STEAM Center intentionally in our largest building that we had just spent $200 million on, right? No landlord does that, puts a high school in the middle of their marquee building. And instantaneously, every tenant in the building loves it, loves it, loves it, loves it. It's like one of the draws for the building now. The building's fully leased, but it's like one of the marketing draws. It's like, you can be co-located with this high school. So private industry wants to do this stuff. It just needs government to do its part. So I think the STEAM Center is one thing that certainly could be modeled and replicated in other major economic development initiatives. And it's something we've talked to the administration about. The rest of it is hard to comment on because we do have this extraordinary asset. I do think that part of the model is that I and Joanna, not for the last couple of months, but go to the yard every day. And that intimacy, that God bless them, my tenants, I've probably gotten 4 or 5 emails from them, so I know everything that's going wrong at the Navy Yard. And that level of intensive stewardship is certainly a major part of our model. And we've accumulated a really amazing team. And when they're on site and there's a problem, they're going to fix it just because they got to fix it, right? Like it's who they are. And that's true with our workforce development team, where it's like, we're in it, we're like imbued in it. And so it's actually a constant challenge to figure out what we're not going to do, because we generate so many ideas and we can't possibly execute them all. That's more the problem than anything else. So, there are elements of our model, I think, that can be taken elsewhere, but we are very unique. And to Steve's point, there are.
David and Carlos, I'm going to jump in on that because Carlos, I agree with you 100% on that. So the challenge then becomes, right, since you have a successful model, so many different districts, and that's where the council members can be huge asset, are not comprised of that type of setup, or maybe don't have the ability to have a large building to house the STEAM Center. So then we have to go to the next level of how do you connect to those communities, and it's through pilot programs and connecting out to a community that may not have that resource to get those students excited about there is a job right here in New York City. And yes, it may not go the traditional educational path, and you can do it. And now all of a sudden you're bringing that excitement to those tendrils can go right out to districts. So I say that because my district is a very, very large district that doesn't have any of that type of infrastructure to do that. So we work with schools, like you said, unfortunately, with a basement or something that can get the kids a pilot program to you, so they know there's that hope, the light at the end of the tunnel. So it's
and let me just clarify
what growing what Carlos was saying, this great platform, and then bringing it so that if there is any type of expansion project, whether it's small or large, that at any level there should be a STEAM educational component immediately to it, so that it can connect immediately to this hub that what Carlos is talking about, the future of how we're going to generate students.
And let me clarify one thing about
that's
the STEAM.
That's the next challenge. That's the stuff, that reason why we come to work and to say, okay, let's do that. That's
right. Let me clarify one thing about the STEAM Center. We actually are that tendril. It is the tendril model. So the STEAM Center is located at the Navy Yard, but there are 8 high schools that send students, and those high schools go all throughout central Brooklyn, and include some of the higher performing schools and some of the lower performing schools. So there are students who are east of their home high school and are like in East Flatbush and come to the Navy Yard every day. So I think it is possible, and are in residential neighborhoods, and the high schools in residential neighborhoods. But for the part of the day that they're in the CTE classes, they come to a facility co-located with business. And again, I just want to say this is not about tracking students into working with your hands. Most of our students have gone on to college. The vast majority of the students at the STEAM Center have gone on to college. A higher percentage of the STEAM Center students have gone to college than from their home high school, and we're not creaming. So it's about engaging the students and expecting them to do more. Some of them will work through college in construction or cybersecurity or what have you. But what we are definitely finding is that if you expect more of the students and you connect it to the real world, they do more, and they do more happily. The principal actually had to implement, he closes the school at 6 and he has to throw the kids out.
I remember that. When we were at the tour, we
Hanging out there doing like personal projects.
They don't leave.
That is not normal high school.
Alex, do you want to close this out with one last question, or?
No, I just want to say thank you. This is a great conversation. I know we're going to continue having it, and I think it's the beginnings of this next chapter that we're building, and it's happening at the Navy Yard. Thank you.
Thank you, council member. And one last check with our committee council. Any other questions or panels that may have come in?
Chair, seeing that there are no public members who have signed up to testify, I guess I'll just turn it back to you for closing remarks.
So one thing we definitely have in common, David, is amazing staff around us, and that's how we can prepare. So Joanna, you got a great team there, and it's clearly, as you can see from a council member, whether we're in Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, Manhattan, Staten Island, everyone looks at this model as to what they want to bring. So I wanted to give you that format today to expand upon our visit so that we could do that. One of the staff that I'm lucky to have joined our office in the last year, we just promoted him to our legislative director at council, is Kevin Koprowski. So Kevin, if you're watching and looking, thank you for preparing for this and getting the questions, and for the team, for Alex and Emily and Aaliyah and Jonathan Ahmed. We thank you all. Another great hearing for us to go to look forward to, and gives a little hope with what's coming with these months. So you know that the city and there are nonprofits and groups ready to pivot when they are ready to need to produce additional medical equipment for us. And we're very thankful for that. So everyone have a blessed, healthy, and happy Thanksgiving. And with that, we close today's hearing. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much.